In this lecture, we will examine the history of global pandemics by considering several well-recognized pandemics, including Spanish flu, smallpox, tuberculosis, and the more recent HIV pandemic. And I'm sure all of these are familiar with you, so let's get started. We'll start our examination of historic pandemics by first considering Spanish flu circa 1918-1919. The Spanish influenza virus was first identified in the United States in the early spring of 1918 as it infected soldiers at an army training camp in Kansas. Now, more than 100 soldiers were hospitalized by 11 March, and more than 500 were infected just days later. And by the end of that month, the virus that was first identified in Kansas was reported in New York, 1,300 miles away. Now, the causative agent of Spanish flu was an early mutation of the H1N1 virus. Now, you might recall H1N1 from the recent swine flu pandemic of 2009. So, victims initially present with similar flu-like symptoms, such as fever, chills, general malaise, muscle aches, headache, nausea, the usual flu symptoms that I'm sure you're familiar with. As H1N1 settles in the lungs, however, severe coughing and sneezing ensues, and therein lies the pathogen's preferred airborne route of transmission. Spanish influenza was so named because Spain was the only European country reporting on the pandemic during World War I. Spain remained neutral during the war. The other countries didn't report on the devastating effects of H1N1 in order to protect troop morale. H1N1 causes an immune reaction spike in its otherwise healthy victims, so while most flus devastate the very young as well as the very old, or in other words those with immature or weakened immune systems, H1N1 is most damaging to the healthy adult population. So despite its lack of headline attention, about 500 million people worldwide were infected, and H1N1 resulted in the deaths of nearly 100 million people. That was about 5% of the world's population at that time. So just how deadly was the disease? Well, scholars have estimated that the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19 killed 25 million people in its first 25 weeks. 1 million people a week, that's incredible. H1N1 killed more people in 1 year than the Great Black Death, bubonic plague, killed in 1 century. Spanish flu killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years, thus making the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919 what some have christened the greatest medical holocaust in the history of the world. The exact origin of Spanish flu is not known. However, the virus was spread from person to person via close living conditions, massive troop movements, and the institution of long-distance travel. Nevertheless, in spite of its obvious lethality, Spanish flu subsided within the year. This, of course, was most likely due to the H1N1 virus mutating into a less lethal form. And while the emergence in 2009 of a new strain of the virus caught some off guard, the World Health Organization declared in August 2010 that the H1N1 swine flu pandemic was over. No doubt that change in H1N1 status was due to the development of effective immunization. Let's next consider the smallpox pandemic circa 1780-1980. And I know what you're thinking, 200 years is a mighty big chunk of history. That's true, but the pandemic actually began long before then. In fact, the earliest evidence of smallpox infection was discovered in the mummified remains of Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V, who died in 1157 BC, more than 3,000 years ago. Scholars believe that the pathogen was carried by Chinese sailors to Japan, where between 735 and 737 AD, it killed about 1/3 of the population of Japan. Smallpox would periodically bloom across Europe during the Middle Ages, between about 400 and 1400 AD. However, it didn't really become established there until number one, the population significantly grew, and number two, people started to travel more between distant locations. Significant here is the fact that smallpox became established in Europe as exploration and colonization by the Europeans hastened the spread of the disease around the world. By the 16th century, smallpox had become a significant cause of mortality throughout the world, killing as many as 30% of those infected. and by the end of the 18th century, as many as 400,000 Europeans died from the disease annually. Officials have estimated that smallpox is responsible for between 300 and 500 million deaths during the 20th century alone. Smallpox is a highly contagious disease, obviously, caused by the pathogenic virus variola. That's derived from the Latin meaning spotted or pimple. Of course, those spots are one of the hallmarks of smallpox. Smallpox attacks the vascular system of the skin, the mouth, and the throat before ultimately spreading to the rest of the body. Early onset of the disease is diagnosed from its characteristic rash of red spots, and those spots then morph into fluid-filled blisters. Smallpox is transmitted through direct contact with body fluids of an infected person or with fomites, such as contaminated clothing or bedding. English physician Edward Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine in 1796 using the cowpox inoculant. Now, people were very superstitious in that day, and so because he used cowpox, that led many people to obviously falsely believe that recipients of the vaccine would sprout cow appendages. The U.S. Congress passed the Vaccine Act of 1813 to ensure the safe vaccination of the population of the United States. The 1950s saw the eradication of smallpox from most countries of the Western Hemisphere through the efforts of the Pan American Health Organization. In 1966, the International Smallpox Eradication Unit was formed, and that was led by American Donald Henderson, seen here. A year later, the World Health Organization ramped up its global smallpox eradication efforts and also implemented a novel disease surveillance system. 1972 saw the last major European outbreak of smallpox. That occurred in Yugoslavia. Now, the outbreak infected 175 people and caused only 35 deaths. Yugoslavian authorities declared martial law, enforced quarantine, and initiated revaccination of the population, and the outbreak was over after just 2 months. By the end of 1975, smallpox persisted only in the Horn of Africa. Civil war and famine there made monitoring and containment of the disease and administration of vaccinations nearly impossible. However, a subsequent intensive surveillance, containment, and vaccination program was eventually implemented in that part of Africa. The last naturally occurring case of variola major was detected in October of 1975 in a 2-year-old Bangladeshi girl. And finally, after successful vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the World Health Organization certified the eradication of smallpox in December 1979. And to this day, smallpox is the only human infectious disease to have been completely eradicated, a true testament to what can be accomplished when the worldwide community works together. So let us now consider tuberculosis, circa 1882 to the present. Tuberculosis, or TB, is a widespread and contagious disease caused by the pathogenic bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's derived from the Greek meaning consumption, and consumption is a term used historically for the disease. Tuberculosis attacks the respiratory system of the affected person, and it may metastasize to other organs. Telltale symptoms of tuberculosis include chronic cough, bloody sputum, fever, night sweats, and dramatic weight loss. TB is transmitted through the air as the diseased individual coughs or sneezes, subsequently releasing infected droplets into the air where they are inhaled by other individuals in the immediate vicinity. Tuberculosis has been around seemingly since the beginning of recorded time, and like smallpox, evidence of TB has been verified in Egyptian mummies. There is also proof of the presence of the disease in North America some 17,000 years ago. That evidence was discovered in the remains of bison. The pathogenic bacillus Mycobacterium tuberculosis was first identified by Robert Koch in 1882. Due to its virulence, TB was the greatest public health concern of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Because tuberculosis is transmitted via infected respiratory droplets, it is of extreme concern in small and enclosed spaces, as well as in areas lacking proper cleansing or hygiene, and for these reasons, TB was considered mainly a disease of the urban poor. In America, those infected with tuberculosis were encouraged to admit themselves to a sanatorium or sanitarium. Now, these were public institutions. They offered to those who entered medical care as well as plenty of fresh air. Sanatoria were built usually in the mountains, where it was thought that the cool, clean air would hasten the patient's recovery. In spite of the best intentions, though, of those operating the sanatoria, 50% of the patients who entered there died within 5 years. Now, it's estimated that 1/3 of the population of the world today has been infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. New infections occur in about 1% of the global population per year. In 2007, nearly 14 million people suffered with active tuberculosis, and there were about 9 million new cases reported in 2013. As 50% of those infected with TB die, nearly 1.5 million TB-related deaths occurred the same year. In 1993, the World Health Organization declared TB a global health emergency. In 2006, a global initiative to stop TB was undertaken, and through worldwide education and vaccination, the number of new TB cases reported did, in fact, dramatically drop. However, despite the valiant efforts of those involved in the war to eradicate TB, recent years have witnessed a dramatic surge in the number of reported tuberculosis cases. And that surge is likely the result of new forms of antibiotic-resistant strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, as well as increased numbers of AIDS-related TB cases. And that brings us to our final historic pandemic example. Let's finally consider the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS, pandemic circa 1910 to the present. The causative agent of AIDS, as we have said, is the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. HIV evolved from the simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, which infected several species of non-human primates in West Central Africa. Geneticists, in fact, have confirmed that HIV diverged from SIV around 1910. The consensus is that humans contracted SIV through the handling and consumption of infected bushmeat. Once in its new host, SIV quickly mutated to a form able to evade the human immune system. Now get this, SIV didn't really have far to go to become HIV, as humans and primates, like chimpanzees, are genetically similar by more than 99%. The first documented case of HIV infection occurred around 1959, and that was in the Congo. The vast majority of HIV infections outside of sub-Saharan Africa can be traced to a single individual who became infected in Haiti and subsequently brought the virus to the United States around 1969. As HIV is a blood-borne pathogen, it rapidly spread among promiscuous men, and by 1978, it is estimated that several thousand individuals across the country had been infected by the virus. As we said, the causative agent of AIDS is the pathogenic virus HIV. Now, AIDS, the disease, is defined in terms of either a CD4 T cell count below 200, that's 200 cells per microliter of blood, or the occurrence of specific conditions associated with HIV infection. The most common of those conditions include pneumocystis pneumonia, cachexia, or wasting syndrome, esophageal candidiasis, and recurring respiratory tract infections. Symptoms of AIDS may include prolonged fever, night sweats, chills, weakness, swollen lymph nodes, diarrhea, as well as psychiatric and neurological problems. Due to their weakened immune systems, AIDS sufferers are also extremely susceptible to various cancers, as well as respiratory infections, guess what, like tuberculosis. HIV is a blood-borne pathogen, and therefore transmission requires intimate contact with either infected blood or other body fluids. And without adequate treatment, about 50% of those infected with HIV will ultimately develop AIDS within 10 years. As a pandemic, there are currently some 35 million people worldwide infected with the AIDS virus, and that figure includes more than 1 million people in the United States. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the world's hotspot for total infections. In fact, 68% of the population of the countries in that area are infected. That's nearly 23 million people. HIV/AIDS is responsible for about 66% of the deaths in that region. In Botswana, life expectancy has dropped from 65 to 35 years due to HIV/AIDS. South and Southeast Asia remain the second most affected region, accounting for about 4 million cases. Most of those cases are coming out of India. There are about 86,000 cases of HIV/AIDS infection in the United Kingdom, about 65,000 cases in Canada. There are about 27,000 cases in Australia. There are about 1.1 million cases in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. That includes Russia, the Ukraine, Romania, Poland, those areas on the Eastern European side, and northern China, Mongolia, and all of the Stan countries, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, those areas on the Central Asia side. And there are about 1.5 million cases of HIV/AIDS infection in Latin America. Now, in the next lecture, we will summarize the information that we covered in this section. Then you will be ready for your first quiz. So good luck on the quiz, and I hope to see you in section 3.